And that's what I love. I love that kind of a community because, again, people are helping you to document something so that other people who are interested in that topic can enjoy it as well.
That is author Dave Bossert, who's here to talk about the Monsanto House of the Future. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 221 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Really excited about today's guest, Dave Bossert, who's returning to the podcast. He was here a few years ago to talk about his book about Claude Coats. He's written a bunch of cool books about Disney history, and his latest book is called The House of the Future, Walt Disney, MIT, and Monsanto's Vision of Tomorrow, which is all about the history and everything surrounding the Monsanto House of the Future at Disneyland, which was there from 1957 through 1967. I'm too young enough to have visited that, but it's so interesting to me, all the story behind it. And the book also takes a really fun tour where you go through each room of the House of the Future. So Dave is here to dive into everything that went into his book and then give us a lot of cool insight about the House of the Future. So let's get right to it. Here is Dave Bossert. Dave, thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Hey, Dan, it's my pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you having me.
Oh, for sure. It was really fun when we talked about your Claude Coats book, which I really enjoyed, and then was able to get a copy of The House of the Future, which I also thought was awesome because I never went there. I was too young and know very little about it. I've come to learn pretty quickly. But I'm curious for you, just how you got interested in writing a book about such a cool attraction from Disneyland.
Well, I think if you look at my body of work as far as my book writing goes, I tend to gravitate to projects that really haven't been written about very much. Nobody had done a book on Claude Coats. Nobody had done a book on the Disney animation furniture that was designed by Kem Weber. There was no book really on Roy E. Disney at the time when I wrote mine. So I tend to gravitate to projects that, haven't really been covered. And by the way, having done The House of the Future, the reason why I gravitated to it was I was fascinated by the house itself. I was somebody who, the first time I went to Disneyland was 13 years after The House of the Future was taken out. I never got to walk through it. And I wanted to set up the book as an immersive experience to people who hadn't seen it, who would maybe come away with the sense like they did experience the house without physically walking through it. And the people who had seen it, it would bring back a flood of memories for them from their childhoods.
Yeah, well, similar boat here. I didn't go to Disneyland till 1985, and you mentioned not having gone there again till much later, I believe 1980. Beyond the fact that there wasn't a book, I mean, what was it about this attraction for you that really connected with you and made you think like, wow, this would be a good book?
I think, part of it was just the futurism of it, the idea that they were projecting out 30 years into the future. And they actually were fairly accurate in predicting certain things, not necessarily that came to be 30 years out, but came to be 50 years out or whatever it was. And I also was very fascinated with the furnishings. I think if you notice in the book, I talk quite a bit about the various furniture designers and who designed what. The House of the Future, some people think it was a Disney attraction. It was actually a Monsanto research project that found its way into Disneyland. And that was because Monsanto had a relationship with Disney. Walt was friends with the CEO of Monsanto, and Monsanto was an early sponsor at the park with the Hall of Chemistry. And the Hall of Chemistry was there in Tomorrowland on opening day. It was one of the few things they had in Tomorrowland, and so I think it seemed natural for them to talk. And for the CEO of Monsanto to say, hey, we're working on this cool research project with MIT. And then I have a picture of Walt at the plastics convention in New York City in 1956. Where he's actually seeing the model, and Marvin Goody, one of the architects, is explaining how the house is constructed and what's it made of and all of those things. It's something that I imagine Walt Disney would have been just fascinated by and excited about, because he was such a forward-looking individual, and he was also had up to that point had a track record of trying new things. He was the first to put synchronized sound to an animated cartoon with Steamboat Willie, and he was, the first to jump into the Technicolor process and actually got an exclusive with Technicolor for Disney cartoons when it was first developed. So he was, always stretching the boundaries and looking at, what is the new next thing. And so, I think it was only natural that they would put the House of the Future into the entrance of Tomorrowland at Disneyland, just because of the foot traffic, because it really was a giant research project. Monsanto really wanted to expand into the building industry with their plastics. And, this was an opportunity to partner with a lot of companies and to put futuristic things and ideas into this one location at the park that people could walk through for free. And they had cast members there asking questions and doing, research, just filling out surveys and things like that to understand what the public was thinking.
Well, you covered so much with that I could dive in a bunch of different directions, but I am curious a little more about the work with MIT, because they work with the MIT School of Architecture, and like you mentioned, it was more of a research project, which, it's easy just to kind of look at the house and kind of the way it looks and think of it more like you said, it's like a Disney thing, which it kind of was, but it mostly was something else. But how did Monsanto and MIT kind of get started on that? Even before it was built in Disneyland.
Well, Monsanto's plastic division was located in Massachusetts. MIT's in Boston. I think that they obviously there had to have been some folks that knew each other, and I think that what they wanted to do was reach out not only to the architectural division but the civil engineering department as well, because it was both architecture and engineering that were involved in the research project, and the mandate really was to design a new house. And you have to realize that at that time, it wasn't very long after World War II ended. It's 7-8 years after World War II ended. Plastics were in their infancy. A lot of the developments of plastics during World War II was for the military, and now they were taking what they learned and what they developed and trying to apply that to the civil to society. And then you had the exodus from the city to the suburbs. You had the baby boom generation. The GIs were coming home. They were getting married. They were starting families. They were moving out of the cities, out into the suburbs. There was a building boom going on. There were some supply chain issues with materials. So Monsanto was seizing on an opportunity to say, how could we redesign a house using our plastics? And the mandate really was to come up with a design that would allow the house to be constructed in a modular fashion using plastics or fiberglass, which is, a form of plastics, to create these curvilinear structural pieces that could be put together to create the home. and so it was one giant experiment, and they got like something like 30 other companies involved, other divisions of Monsanto that were making synthetic fibers like acrylon and nylon and rayon and all of those kinds of things. You had companies that were making foam, foam cushions and things like that. They were partnered with Owens Corning on the fiberglass, which was a brand, coming up with an inventive way of building a house without actually using 2x4s or wood. And that mandate was to try and use plastics for everything in the house that was reasonable. It wasn't like, you weren't gonna force, let's make plastic 2x4s. It wasn't that kind of a thing. It was really, how can we build a house without 2x4s?
It's still kind of amazing to think about what they did and how it ultimately came together. And, it's interesting too. I know Disney obviously still has sponsors for attractions now, but it's very different. I feel like, being that it was the 1950s and early 60s, I'm curious to get you to talk a little bit about, the fact, like we're saying, this is really a Monsanto and other companies driven attraction. How different, this feels a little like things that would have been like the 64 World's Fair and some of the other aspects of that time period. How different was the view of corporations back then? Because I feel like it would be different.
I know where you're going with this, because I do feel like, today a lot of people have negative views of giant corporations. They're evil, or, they're destroying the environment, all of those kinds of things. But I think back then it was very different. And I address this in the book, by the way, because, Monsanto's, they're not an angel company, you know what I mean? By any stretch of the imagination. But at the time, plastics were in their infancy. And in a sense, this is a situation that repeats itself through history. There's this brand new material, plastic, again, in its infancy. Nobody knew what was going to happen 50 or 70 years later.
Oh, sure.
And the fact that we have plastics polluting the environment, and forever chemicals and microplastics showing up in the food chain, right? Nobody realized that. What that falls under is the unintended consequences of something new, right? And we, not you and I, but somebody like us will be having this conversation 50 years from now about artificial intelligence, right? And the unintended consequences of something that we don't know now, but something will happen with artificial intelligence, and I laughingly say, activate Skynet, the robots take over and try to destroy humankind, right? I mean, I don't think it'll be that extreme, but every new technology has some unintended consequences that comes along with it. We're just witnessing it, by the way, with these huge winter storms that have moved across the central and northern part of the country, in that because of these really sub-zero temperatures, electric car batteries are going dead, right? So that is an unintended consequence. I don't think people anticipated that, and the more electric vehicles are getting out into the environment, the more we're starting to understand certain things are happening. The cars don't operate very well or at all in sub-zero temperatures. The batteries are super toxic, and, issues in disposing of those or trying to recycle the materials from them. So these are all unintended consequences. Well, it's the same thing with plastics. And back in the 50s, Monsanto was a miracle company. They were doing all kinds of cool things, coming up with synthetic, fibers that, would make carpets wear longer, and all of these great things that would make life better. Who knew, right? Who knew?
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to pin anything on. I feel like you do a really good job in the book of mentioning, obviously from our perspective, like you just said, plastic is much different now than it was viewed then. But like you said, it was so new. And from this house and everything else, it was like, wow, the future, there's going to be some some great things with it. So I think you do a great job about that. I just find it really interesting to think about corporations and how they're viewed, even because, like we saw with a lot of what Walt was doing, like in the 64 World's Fair, and like what he meant, what they might have done with Epcot, there was a different view, even going all the way up to Epcot Center with the view of corporations. So I found that really interesting. You brought up a good point too, because what I found so interesting in the book was about how much testing they had to do, because the structure had to be so strong given weather and given all the people. So, I mean, how involved was that with like just all the testing they had to do for the House of Future? Because like you write, if it had a problem, that like could kill an entire industry, basically.
Absolutely. And so they did their due diligence, and they really went, well beyond the stresses that would be put on those what they're referring to as the fiberglass bents. Each wing was made up of 4 fiberglass bents, 2 on top, 2 on the bottom, that were bolted together and attached to a central core. And they really did an enormous amount of stress testing. They set up 2 bents hanging off of a central core, bolted it all together the way the house would be built. And then they loaded a whole bunch of 55-gallon drums onto the floor and the roof of those bents and filled them with water, and then just let them sit for months through temperature changes, weather changes, and all kinds of stuff to stress it. And I write an interesting fact in the book that after 10 years, when they finally did demolish the house, several things happened. First, the wings of the house had settled less than 1/4 of an inch over a 10-year period, with 20 million people going through the house. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, when they actually demolished the house, the wrecking ball did bounce off and did no damage to it. You got to remember, each of those bents had 32 layers of fiberglass, cloth, and epoxy. 32 layers. So, and when they finally brought in these chain clamps to wrap around the wings and then to crush them essentially into pieces, the steel bolts that went through the fiberglass flanges to hold it to the concrete core, the bolts broke before the fiberglass flange broke. They over-engineered it to a point, and they needed to do that because, as you said, if they had a failure, if there was a problem, it could have just wiped out the use of plastics in homes for decades. And as it was, they never really used fiberglass structural pieces in home construction. I mean, today they use polystyrene and use certain things for decorative portions of houses, but not really structural that I'm aware of. Plastics play a big part in piping. Person who's listening to this should just sit and look around. If you're in your car is full of plastics. If you're at home, you could look around your house and there's a ton of stuff that's made of plastics. And by the way, I'm not defending plastics.
Sure.
What I am doing is taking a snapshot of a period, 1957 to 1967, for this particular attraction. And there were actually a lot of good things that came out of the attraction. When you look at new home construction today, the fiberglass shower tub enclosures that are in most bathrooms today in production homes, that was an outgrowth of Crane doing a 2-piece fiberglass bathroom that was all pre-molded for the House of the Future. The use of safety glass, where you're sandwiching 2 glass panels between a thin layer of plastic. Safety glass was an outgrowth from the House of the Future. There were other things that were done in there, and there was forward-looking things. They had a camera at the front door. It's very reminiscent of the Ring system that's available today and other brands, but Ring, everybody knows what the Ring system is with the doorbell camera. That was something that they envisioned back in the mid 50s, and flat panel televisions and central air conditioning. There was so many cool things that were contributed by partner companies in the building of that house.
Oh yeah, there's so many things that you can connect in some way to what we have today, and it's just super cool. Well, I also want to ask you mentioned Disneyland and just Monsanto being involved early on, but also with this opening of 57, that was before even the monorail subs Matterhorn in 59 and then all the other changes obviously in 67. Could you talk a little bit about, because the House of the Future was very popular, but like what Tomorrowland was like at that time around when it opened? Because I think about like what early Tomorrowland is, but it's all essentially 1959 forward. There was, so much that wasn't there, and what was there is kind of a bit silly in some ways.
Yeah, I do want to touch on real quickly. The fact is that Walt could not have opened Disneyland without partner companies and sponsors.
Sure.
I mean, it just would not have happened. And 6 months prior to the July 1955 opening of Disneyland, Walt had decided to actually open Tomorrowland. For a period of time, the thought was, we're not going to open Tomorrowland because we don't have enough there. We won't be able to get it done. But 6 months before the park opened, he said, no, we have to do it. So they threw a bunch of stuff together. It was very sparse when they first opened Tomorrowland. And some of the new things that came in were in 57 the House of the Future and some other exhibits that they put in. Tomorrowland was always a difficult land because, as Walt said, as soon as you build it, it's yesterday. They've always had a little bit of trouble. I think they kind of solved the problem at Paris Disneyland, because the Paris Disneyland Tomorrowland area is sort of this Jules Verne's, 20,000 Leagues overlay, this kind of steampunk retro futuristic look that doesn't get dated because it's kind of cool looking, right? So that kind of works there, but Tomorrowland, it just was very sparse, and they had to make do with what they had. But again, Walt could not have opened that park if it wasn't for all those corporate sponsors and the lessees. You can't forget about the lessees along Main Street, USA. All those little shops were mom and pop shops that were paying rent to Disney, and as soon as the park opened, then they knew it was a smash success. The money started flowing in, and it was, within 10 years, the lessees were gone from, for the most part, from Main Street, USA. You still had like Bank of America and a few other things in there, but for the most part, they were gone, all the little mom and pop shops. And then they started towards the end of the 60s and into the 70s, were phasing out a lot of corporate sponsorships. And I think later on, when you get into the 80s and 90s, there's pitfalls to having sponsors, because you could be partnered with a company for the long haul, and that company could do something horrendous that puts it in a negative light, within the public. So, you can see why, the company has drifted away from having those kinds of partnerships outside of things like Coca-Cola, and you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, yeah. Even like, when, you're partnered with Exxon, and then you don't know at the time that they're going to have, the situations that they had back in, the 80s and 90s. Plenty of companies have had issues. We're not trying to pick on them. But yeah, it was a different time period. But like you said, so important to Disneyland and Tomorrowland. I mean, those first 5 to 10 years of Disneyland, so many changes, and the House of the Future was there for a good portion of it, really kind of standing there while things changed around it in a way.
Yeah, and and I think that when you look at like 1959 is looked at as sort of the second opening of Disneyland, because by that point they had the money and they had the gravitas of the park to be able to put in some really cool attractions that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do earlier on, and also get rid of some of the cheap ones.
Well, right. Yeah. You could get rid of the, Holiday Hill.
Yeah. And, Phantom boats and things like that they were always having problems with.
Digging a little bit into the book too, like and how you wrote it, how were you able to go about researching it? Because I think one of the things when I like, a lot of attractions, newer ones, you look up, oh, there's all these YouTube videos and everything else. How's the Future doesn't have that much, and you have really cool photos and tons of information. So how did you go about kind of putting that together and gathering photos and ultimately getting the info where you can have this book that's pretty comprehensive?
Well, again, there's always detective work involved in finding material, and but there's tons of material out there. There's archives scattered all around the United States. Like when I did my Kem Weber book, I was able to find Kem Weber's archives, which he had donated all of his papers and architectural drawings and everything to a university here in California. And so being able to go and make an appointment with an archivist and have them pull out the specific material that I was looking for, because I wasn't interested in, the shoe store he designed up in San Francisco or the department store in Los Angeles. I was specific to the furniture for the Disney studios. So I was able to, really have them pull a ton of stuff out. A lot of it hadn't been seen before, and some of it had never been scanned digitally. So, you pay to have these things scanned. And that's what I did with House of the Future. There were archives, Monsanto's archives, MIT's archives, and all of these places had material. And I was especially interested in a lot of the material that they hadn't scanned yet. And I paid to have a lot of stuff scanned. I was able to use a lot of it in the book, but there were some things that I had scanned that I wound up ultimately not using for just creative choices. You know what I mean? It was duplicates or things that were similar or things that might not be relevant in a book format, but there were, and there were also private archives. There were people out there that had, tons of photographs that they had taken or that other people had taken and they had collected over the years. So it was really sort of hunting and gathering. And what's wonderful about doing a book like this is that it's really a document. It's a record of something that hadn't been really recorded in this fashion. In fact, I was very, very pleased to hear somebody refer to it as the definitive book on the House of the Future, which was, it makes you feel good. It brought a smile to my face. I think that just going about any kind of a project that I take on, I always really want to find a lot of stuff out there. So when I announced that I was doing this project, a lot of people came out of the woodwork and reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have a ton of photos. I have this, I have that." And I was just like, "Hey, I'd love to see whatever you have." People sent me scans of magazine articles from Popular Science in the 1950s and stuff like that. And I just thought it's great because it's a wonderful, the Disney fandom is a great community of people. Because everybody's passionate about certain aspects, certain facets of the Disney universe. And there's people that want to help and want to be a part of it. And that's what I love. I love that kind of a community because, again, people are helping you to document something so that other people who are interested in that topic can enjoy it as well.
Oh, definitely. That's one of the best things about the internet, in a way. Like speaking of things that have had unintended consequences, but in a good way, it allows you to connect with so many people that are so passionate about different elements of, well, any topic, but it's just looking at Disney about Disney. And I'm sure that helped a lot. The thing that really impressed me is when you have the main section of the book, really, but the part of where it's like a tour, where like you referenced this earlier, wanting to have kind of an immersive experience of going through it. When I picked up the book, I was kind of thinking before I opened it, this is going to be a history book. And you start out and you're giving history, and I think that's great, but you dig so much further. So I'm curious just a little bit about how you decided to go that way, where essentially you went through room by room by room and did it that way versus kind of doing a more straight up history book.
I think the material speaks to me. I know that sounds kind of, cliche or crazy or whatever. But for me, any project I work on, the subject matter speaks to me at some point. And the more I dug into my research, because I spent a lot of time researching before I even started writing, I just got it in my head that I wanted it to be a tour based on the tour that they gave. When I laid out, the chapters of the book, they're laid out exactly the way you would have seen it had you walked through the house of the future. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, well, for people who hadn't seen the house, they're going to experience it the way it was. They're going to tour it the same way. And for the people who had seen the house, had experienced it, it will be in the same way that they saw it, and that will help jog their memory and flood memories back to them by going through it the same way they would have when they walked through it physically. So for me, it became a no-brainer to set it up that way, and I couldn't imagine doing it any other way than the tour. And I specifically put a 2-page spread with a tour map and explain that the following chapters are going to be a tour the way you would have seen it. And then even put in the narration of the attraction at the back of the book for people to read. I wanted to do it as immersive and as fun as it could possibly be.
Oh yeah, that definitely comes through. And for me, someone like you who didn't visit it, I feel like you get a pretty good gauge, as much as you can, from pictures and descriptions of what it's like. So I'm curious too. You mentioned a few times in the book just about how, like with the kitchen, how the fridge is so small, or even the kids' bedroom is kind of, very minimalist. Do you think, from now learning so much about it, I know this was a presentation that showed some cool technology. Could someone really, I'm sure they could, but would it be feasible to live in a house that was designed exactly like this?
I absolutely think so. And I'll tell you why. I don't think I could live in this kind of a house year round unless I live by myself. But I think that I could absolutely go to a place like that with my wife, my kids, and spend a weekend or spend a week or two. Maybe it's a second house in the mountains or out by the beach. I absolutely believe that. I also think that you could scale this design, instead of a 16-foot by 16-foot base for the house. What if you did a 20-foot by 20-foot or a 25 by 25 square core, and we're able to make the wings a little larger, lengthwise, because you're expanding the width. I think it's a design that should be revisited. Personally, I suggest in towards the end of the book that maybe the Walt Disney Company should build a couple of these as guest accommodations at the Contemporary Resort in Orlando. You build 2 or 3 of them, or if you wanted to, you could build a subdivision of them and let guests, stay in them, as accommodations. I think people would love to do it and experience it. And I say that because the Howard Johnsons in Anaheim, California, right next to, you can see, the Matterhorn and Space Mountain, from the Howard Johnsons in Anaheim. They put in a retro House of the Future suite into the hotel, and my wife and I had the opportunity to spend a night in there before it opened to the public 2 years ago. And I just thought, wow, this is even better. This is such a great immersive experience because now you're in the house, you're in something that has all these design elements that tie back to the House of the Future and really gives you, a cool experience.
Oh yeah, you have some really cool pictures of that suite where I even looked at that and I forget the exact amount. I was like, how much do they charge for this? And I know it varies by day and it's a lot, but really it's not so much. Where I think your idea about the Contemporary Resort or somewhere out there is brilliant. Disney, is always looking for new ways to draw the high price clientele. And there are people that would really be into something like that. And it would also just be really fun to tour or to see. It's a neat idea, especially with, different types of themed hotel rooms. I think it would draw a lot of interest. You should pitch that to them. That's a good idea.
again, as we move along as a society, people are gravitating more to experiences than stuff,
Right.
and to me, if you were to, come up with a new design, I mean, based on exactly what they had as the house of the future, but update the construction methods and materials, maybe use more sustainable materials and things like that. I think, this would be a very awesome experience for a family of 4 or 5, or to go and stay in for 3 days or a week or whatever it is, and people, I think, would be willing to spend the money to do it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, they could put a few suites in the Disneyland Hotel. Now it'd feel like they were copying Howard Johnson's, but if they had done that, whew,
yes,
it would be impressive. But if it was a freestanding thing, my gosh.
Yeah, I know. I absolutely agree with you. And speaking of the size, that house was a little bit, I think it was around 1,200 square feet, just under 1,200 square feet. But each wing is maybe the size of a Disney cruise ship cabin.
Right.
Like the regular cabins. That's about the size of each wing. It's not a very big space. And you can kind of tell, you could really get a sense when those 5 people are standing there. That's not really a big living room, So
yeah, I noticed a lot of the pictures have, the title, the captions. It'll be husband of the future and housewife of the future and all that. So I know they use them for like publicity photos and stuff. But did they like have them ever like doing demos and everything? I didn't totally get like where that kind of model family kind of came in with the marketing and advertising.
Yeah, it was really all about photo shoot with the house, with the family of the future. It was the mom, the dad, the boy and the girl. And they did all these photo shoots in all the different rooms of the house, the family going about their daily living. And that was, it was for publicity. It was for, opening day, all of those kinds of things.
One thing that interested me too is that they did pretty extensive remodels several times. Like this wasn't something where in 1957 it looked the same as 1967. So how extensive were the changes that they made with those updates?
Well, really the changes were the interiors. They did go in and strip out furniture and replace it with updated furniture. They were, I think, they were keeping up with the times. It opened in 57. By 61, they did a remodel. They did a remodel in 63. And I think part of the remodel is 63. They went in and probably changed out a few furniture pieces a couple of times between 63 and 67, just to freshen it up, because you can see different sofas, different designed sofas. I think they were trying to keep it fresh. The house itself was still popular in 67. It could have still kept going. It's just that they took the Hall of Chemistry out and Monsanto put in the Adventure Through Inner Space attraction, which was a ride. Monsanto said to Disney, we don't want to keep paying for the House of the Future. You can have it and do what you want with it. And Disney was like, well, if you're not paying for the maintenance on it, we're taking it out. And that was the end of it. And that's really why that closed down. It had nothing to do with the popularity of the attraction, because it was still a very popular attraction at that point. As you can see with it, you really have to keep remodeling the interior every 2 or 3 years at least in order for it to not feel old or retro. And so that's but the actual shell of the house, the structure itself, I think is a timeless design. It still holds up today.
I mean, it reminds me a little bit of like the villains thing he has out in the water in like James Bond, The Spy Who Loved Me. It almost looks like that. But again, if they put that now, I mean, yes, you would say, oh, it looks like it's mid-century modern, but that style of architecture is still very popular today. So it's interesting. And I was going to say it's the flip side of the sponsorship model too, like we've seen with Epcot, is if the sponsor pulls out, even if it's something really cool that's popular, sometimes they won't survive, which is too bad because I think we talked about the Howard Johnson suite, but then there are also, like, my daughters know about it from the Mickey Mouse cartoon they did with, like, the recent animated one, which was kind of like the House of the Future, but then it kind of rebels against them. But why do you think? Because I feel like we still hear a lot about this, where there are other attractions from the 50s at Disneyland that don't get talked about much. Why do you think this has resonated so strongly with people?
I just think it was such a radical design for a house. And it's got this iconic look to it that it doesn't stand out like anything else. And because of the amount of research, the amount of partner companies, the amount of new things that were being put into it that were projecting out to the future. For instance, like the video telephone didn't even work. It was just really a mock-up to show the public that, oh, look, the housewife of the future could be on the phone with her butcher picking out cuts of meat, I think that plays into all of us, into our imaginations and spark. I've gotten a lot of notes from people who were so moved by the House of the Future that they went into architecture.
Wow.
Because of it. So like, if you can imagine a kid being, just awe-inspired by this futuristic house, and that changed, like, the drive, the path they were on, that they decided they wanted to do that. I think that's just an amazing things to hear. And so there's a lot to unpack with the House of the Future, and I think that's why it resonates more so than, say, the TWA rocket ship, which was just basically an aluminum rocket ship that did nothing. It just stood there. It was the big weenie for the Tomorrowland area,
Right.
It wasn't like it was a ride or something,
Yeah, this has so much more to it, and it can, I think about even like the fact that they already had, like, I know it was contacting the butcher, but I remember being a kid in the 80s and thinking the video phone sounded so cool, and I know they kind of sort of had them, but I mean, and right now you and I are talking like we're in the same room and we're across the country from each other because of Zoom, and this is 65 years ago when so it's pretty impressive that they were, in certain ways, really forward thinking with some of it.
I absolutely agree. And, again, even like the oscilloscope, the giant television, it was this big giant flat panel that did nothing. It was just the idea that it could be this like movie screen television. And that was a harbinger to flat panel televisions that, that are now ubiquitous in society. I was just at Costco the other day, and I was, just my mouth was hanging open as I was looking at an 85-inch television, flat panel, and I thought, my God, and you look back at the 50s, and people were watching these tiny cathode ray tube televisions that were black and white, and they were tiny screens in comparison to what we have today.
Well, even in the 80s, like I remember we had like a 19-inch TV. It was like, wow, this is amazing. Yeah. And it's like, now that's like what people put in their kitchen, or something.
Exactly. So I think that's the fascination of the House of the Future, is all of the gadgets and the inspiration that was in the house, as well as the iconic look of it to boot. All of those things come into play, and it's one of those attractions that, like, as I said at the beginning of the book, that was the one I wish I could have seen. I didn't care about the Phantom boats or the Calistoga wagons or things like that. I mean, you honestly,
come on,
you can see some of that stuff anyway, when you go to a ghost town or, some Western, themed place. But I just, for me, the House of the Future was just so iconic to Disneyland, and it spoke to the optimism of the 1950s, there was just so much in there. And also, The stuff I had read about it was not fulfilling. It was not satisfying because it didn't dive deep enough. And many of the things that were talked about in little articles and whatnot over the years on fan sites and things even got the architects wrong. The picture that everybody sees of Marvin Gooding standing and the other guy sitting, they have the other guy sitting identified as Richard Hamilton, the other architect. That wasn't Richard Hamilton. It was the project engineer, and I was able to in the book correct that long-standing mistake. And one of the sons, Robert Whittier, is the gentleman seated in that famous photograph that's always been identified as Marvin Goody and Richard Hamilton. It's actually Marvin Goody and Robert Whittier. Robert Whittier is sitting. He's the project engineer, and they're photographed in front of the House of the Future. And I put an insert of Richard Hamilton from MIT, his faculty photograph. Sadly, Richard Hamilton died very young. He passed away in 1959, just 2 years after the house opened. Being able to do that because I talked to the son of Robert Whittier, and so gave his father the credit he was long sort of robbed of because he was misidentified. There's just so much in here, and being able to talk about the furniture designers, because there's so many iconic furniture pieces in the book. In fact, I'll tell you, in the chapter for the parents' bedroom, there's a full page photograph at the beginning of the chapter of the housewife of the future adjusting a pillow in what's, an odd looking chair. It's called a bird's nest chair. And this past October, I was on a layover at the Doha airport in Qatar, halfway around the world. And I went up to the business lounge to relax for a couple hours before my next flight. And I walked into the business lounge, and there were a dozen bird's nest chairs in a beautiful burgundy fabric that just blew me away. I knew what they were right away. As soon as I saw them, I went over, I put my luggage down, I turned the chair over, I was looking at it, and then I sat in it. It was one of the most comfortable chairs. And this is a chair that was designed in the mid-1950s, and it was in the House of the Future, and they're still making that chair all these years later. And the coconut lounge chair that's in the House of the Future living room in 1957. It was designed by George Nelson, who was the design director at Herman Miller Furniture Company. That chair you can buy brand new today from Herman Miller.
Wow.
There's just really some very cool and fun things that people hadn't really researched or talked about in any of those articles. And that's really what I wanted to try and get into the text of the book. I mean, honestly, when you think about one attraction and writing 40,000 words or close to 40,000 words on one attraction, that's a mouthful.
No, it's impressive. Yeah, because if you think about, it's a single attraction. Having that much is awesome. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to say the Phantom Boats could do a whole book, but I don't know if it could. Not to pick on that attraction, but since you mentioned earlier, is there anything left? I know you mentioned this in the book that like near the Tinkerbell area. If somebody was there, could they even see like the little bit of the House of the Future left?
Yes. Yeah, there's a retaining wall. It's not, everybody claims it's the foundation. It's not the foundation. It's a retaining wall. And the reason why I know it's a retaining wall, I consulted with retired Imagineer Tom Morris, who worked on the Disneyland project during his, he had a 40-year Imagineering career.
Yeah.
He spent a lot of it working at Disneyland. And, we went over blueprints and photographs and really spent the time to figure it all out. And by the way, just a week ago, I was down at Disneyland and it's the exit out of Pixie Hollow, which is where you can see this retaining wall. You can see the top of it. if you go in through the exit, which for some reason, every time I go down there, I do this. And one of the cast members is coming towards me. I said, I'm not trying to jump the Tinkerbell line. I'm just trying to. I just want to take a look at something in this garden area by the exit. And they're like, oh, yeah, no problem. They're always so gracious about it, you know? And but when you look at that, the top of the retaining wall, it's longer than 16 feet. So it's not the foundation of the house, and it's also a retaining wall which is thinner than the foundation was. So that's the one thing. And so when you enter off the walkway that takes you to the Matterhorn, just off the hub, you go past, there's a small lagoon to your right, and there's the entrance into the Pixie Hollow, meet and greet. There's a bunch of bushes on the left side of that walkway, and that's the corner of the retaining wall. And it's painted green, and it's covered mostly with vegetation, but that's the remnants of what's left, aside from the pond. The little pond that's out in the front there was actually put in because they used the water from the pond for the air conditioning system for the house. That was one of the requirements of putting the house in. They had to have a small body of water next to it because the cooling system used that water.
That's so interesting. Well, Dave, the book is so great. So now that you've finished this book, I know you are very prolific. You've written many books. Do you have certain ones you work on? You may not be able to mention them, but are there things you're working on now that are exciting?
I'm so excited about a number of projects I'm working on. I wish I could talk about it, but it's a little premature, so I don't want to tip my hand. I seem to be on a book a year kind of quest, which is kind of happening. I will tell you that I do have a book that it kind of falls outside of Disney. It's really, the title of it right now is Find Your Happy Place, the 8-step guide to expanding your creativity through a personal retreat. And it's basically, over the last 30 plus years, I've taken a personal retreat every year by myself. It's not a religious retreat, and I'm not knocking religious retreats or anything. This is a creativity retreat for me. And it usually takes a week to 2 weeks. And I'm by myself out in a very sparsely populated part of the United States. And I get to just sit with myself and think about what I've done over the past year and what I'm doing in the coming year, and set some goals for myself and all of that. And I've had so many people say to me, my God, you're so prolific. You do so much stuff. And, how do you do all of this? And this is one of the reasons why. And I've had several people who know that I had been doing this. They've known for a long time that I go off by myself once a year for a couple of weeks and just disappear and unplug and everything. And I've had people asking me, what, you should write a book about this. You should do. So during the pandemic, I actually wrote a book about it, and it's going to come out later this year. So it's not necessarily Disney, but it's a way for people to create their own retreat. And sure. I go through the whole process of what I do, and I talk about the creative process and how creativity works in our mind. And it's something that people, and they don't have to do a week or two. They could do a weekend. They could do a day, and I talk all about that in the book, and I give them sort of a roadmap to do their own personal retreat.
No, that sounds great. That sounds interesting to a wide spectrum of people. Just the chance to do that, whether, like you said, it's a week or two or a few days or whatever, that people are able to do that. And that book sounds really interesting. Well, I know you also co-host the Skull Rock podcast with Elgin Go, and you've had a lot of cool guests. Sometimes there's been crossover even with this show, but I'm curious for you, just if people don't know about the show, you can talk about it a bit, but also just kind of what do you enjoy doing about the show, or some highlights, or kind of what do you like about it?
Well, you know something, I love entertainment, so I'm constantly watching stuff, and I go to the movies almost every week that I'm in town. And I like to see films in IMAX, and I like to be in a movie theater environment. And so for me, it's just a lot of fun to get together with Aljon. And again, the Skull Rock podcast was an outgrowth of the pandemic. Because in August of 2020, at the height of the pandemic, everything shut down. I came out with my 3D Disneyland book, and Disneyland was closed down. So my tagline for the book was "Where the park is always open," right? So, but I was on Al John's podcast, The Disney List, and he interviewed me about the book. And Dan, it was one of those things where I just clicked with Aljon. We had such an easy conversation. It's like I was sitting down with an old friend. Afterwards, I sent him a nice email thanking him for having me on the show. And then he wrote back. He says, "Man," he goes, "Dave, you should do your own podcast." And I said, "Aljon, I've had so many people say that to me over the years." I said, "But if I ever did a podcast, I'd do it with you." And then he came back. He says, "If you're serious, I will do a podcast with you." And then August of 2020, we had our first episode.
Wow. And you're still going strong. I mean, for a podcast, 3.5 years that's pretty good.
Yeah, no, I mean we're doing fantastic, and we have a lot of great guests coming up this year, and we're just having fun. And I think what I like about it most is that it's kind of an oral history of the renaissance of Disney animation. To some degree, and I think that's kind of important. And it's an oral history that's living online for people to access whenever they want. And I can't believe how popular it's gotten, because we're getting emails from people in Taiwan and Australia. And I just got an email from somebody in Greece and, the Netherlands and Germany. It's like people all over the world are listening to the podcast and enjoying it. And we just sit and talk and have fun. And, if the podcast is an hour, it's an hour. If it's 2 hours, it's 2 hours. If it's an hour and a half, we don't try and shoehorn ourselves into a particular time. And I know other people do that, and that's their format. But for us, we just want to have the conversations. And if somebody's, talking, and we don't want to cut them off, we'll extend their interview into 2 or 3 or even 4. I think the longest one now was with Dave Spafford. We did 5 episodes. He was a great storyteller, and he had so much to talk about,
No, it's great. You guys have done such a good job, like you said, with people like animators and artists and people involved with the films.
Yeah.
That's been really cool. Well, I have to ask you then, is you go to the movies so much and everything, like, what are you excited about? Either what's coming or maybe even what you've seen recently that's really like sticking with you?
Gosh, I mean, for 2023, I didn't think it was a great year for movies, but there were some very good films out there. Certainly Oppenheimer was a fantastic biopic. I thought that was wonderfully done, and it's getting rewarded now with all the awards it's picking up. I thought Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning was an excellent film. It didn't do as well at the box office for who knows why, but I thought it was an excellent film, and Tom Cruise certainly delivers. And that was a film, to me, you have to see on a big screen. He's one of the last big movie stars of our generation, and those types of films, I want to see those films on an IMAX screen. The bigger the better, I think. And I also saw a film several months ago, Godzilla -1, which is a Japanese film. It's subtitled, but it was probably one of the best films of the year in my book.
I've heard that from a lot of people.
Yeah, and it was less about Godzilla, and it was more about the redemption of a failed kamikaze pilot and him becoming the hero. And just a very beautifully done film, and very heartwarming, and it had a heart to it. It was I thought a really great film. So those films from last year, and there were others, but those are the ones that stand out. This coming year, I'm certainly looking forward to Inside Out 2 from Pixar. which looks really great. I'm also looking forward to Furioso, George Miller's next
Yeah.
installment of the Mad Max saga. I especially am psyched to see Planet of the Apes. Memorial Day weekend that's coming out. There's a lot of great movies. Dune 2 is coming out in a couple of months. So there's a lot of good movies. I think a lot of people miss a lot in these big epic films if they don't see it on a big screen. I think these films are made for movie theaters and they're not made for small screens. You don't get the same impact of watching, Tom Cruise ride a motorcycle off of a cliff, watching it at home. You really get the impact of it when you're sitting in an IMAX theater, immersed in the screen. I think that this year is going to be a good year for films. I think, there may be a little bit of, a ripple effect from the actors and writers strikes that happens. But I certainly am a champion of movie theaters. But boy, I think the movie theater industry needs to step up to the plate and improve the experience. Not only at the concession stand, but in the theaters themselves.
Yeah, and I used to go to the movies before the pandemic. I was going really, really often, and I found myself needing to go more but you mentioned Mission Impossible. Yeah, that one I circled on the calendar and was like, I'm going to the movie theater for that.
Yeah.
And it was worth it. It was worth it for sure. But,
yeah,
I got out of the habit a little more than I would like just with busyness. Well, Dave, I know I put you on the spot there, but those were all great answers. But if listeners want to check out your books, your podcast, connect with you, where are good places they should go for any of those things?
So you can always go to davidbossert.com. That's my personal website. It's got free stuff, free content. There's like 60 articles I've written on various aspects of animation and Disney history. There's a list of all my books, and there's links to where you can get those books. There's also a tab for free stuff. So if you have one of my books that you got as a gift or bought at a Barnes and Noble or something, and you want it signed, you can get a free book plate. Just you follow the instructions. You write away to me with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll be happy to sign a book plate for you and mail it back to you. If people are interested in getting a copy of the House of the Future book, a signed copy, they can get that at theoldmillpress.com. Theoldmillpress.com. And for your listeners, if they use the code SAVE20, they'll take 20% off their order at the when they check out. Save 20, and they can buy any of the books, not just House of the Future. If they bought 3 or 4 of my books, I'd be extremely happy. But they get 20% off the whole order. And by the way, I did want you to know there is a House of the Future pop-up card that's also available at theoldmillpress.com.
That's awesome.
Is a great little supplement, and it folds flat, so you could put it inside the book if you wanted to.
I love it.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff there. So davidbossert.com, and then if you go to theoldmillpress.com and order one of my books, they're all author signed, my books and some of the other authors there. Use the code SAVE20 and save 20%.
Well, awesome, Dave. Thank you so much. The book's great, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking with me. Thanks so much.
It was my pleasure, Dan. I appreciate you having me, and I look forward to being a guest again at some point in the future.
Well, that was cool. Once again, I want to take a few minutes quickly here to talk about Dave's podcast, the Skull Rock Podcast. I was initially familiar with it, one, from talking to Dave, but also he had Ethan Reed on the podcast, who has been on my show multiple times. And then recently he talked to Joe and Cicero, and they really dug into Disney Cruise Line. And so there has been some crossover with guests here, but one thing that Dave and Aljon do really well is talking to people involved in the world of animation. With Dave's background as an animator and creative director, he knows a lot about that. They recently talked with Rebecca Reese. They had 2 episodes, and she is a storyboard artist, animator, writer, worked on Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, The Brave Little Toaster, so much. Those were really cool episodes. They also talked to John Musker about his new short, I'm Hip. John Musker has been involved in many films that we know about from Disney. And then John Pomeroy was another one. Just a lot of people. And that is a small example of all the different guests they've had. And Dave and Aljan, something I don't really do as much here, they really dig into, like he said on the show, the world of pop culture. They'll talk about their favorite films of the year, what they've seen, kind of that element. So as much as having the guest, it's as much about them and what they've been doing. So that's a pretty big difference, but I find that really interesting when I listen to their show. Of course, you can also check out my last interview with Dave Bossert, which was on episode 152. It came out on November 1st, 2021. I can't believe it's even been that long. It doesn't feel like it. That was all about his book, Claude Coates, Walt Disney's Imagineer. And if you are into the parks and their history, that is a must own. It's described as the making of Disneyland from Toad Hall to the Haunted Mansion and beyond. And wow, he really needs to do a second book. I meant to ask him about that. He hasn't really presented the Walt Disney World side of it from Claude Coates' career, so I can't wait to check that out. You can check out that episode and all the other episodes. There have been 220 other episodes of the Tomorrow Society podcast. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. Check out all those episodes. And if you go back and check out old episodes, I would love to hear from you. I always love hearing that people are going back to the older shows, because they're really evergreen shows for the most part, except for when we talk about news. Send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or a message through wherever, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, just search for Tomorrow Society, and I am out there everywhere. If you'd like to help support the show so I can keep doing cool interviews with people like Dave, there's a great way to do so through Patreon. You can get access to some really cool perks. Bonus podcasts. I just released my Attraction Tribute podcast to Soarin' Over California. That's for the New Horizons tier, which is the new upper level tier that I've just added. But there are multiple different ways you can contribute there and receive access to some really cool perks, starting with the lowest level. You get, a pin, you get membership card, access to extra episodes, lots of cool stuff. Go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society to learn more, or you can just make a one-time contribution. Buy me a Dole Whip or a coffee or whatever you want to call it. But go to tomorrowsociety.com/Dole Whip to learn more about that. The music you are hearing right now was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next week, I will be talking with the host of Rope Drop Radio, a very cool podcast, Doug McKnight and Derek Sasman. We talk about their show and the origins of it, their experiences on the Galactic Star Cruiser, which I never got a chance to do. And then I just quiz them on a lot of questions of their opinions about Walt Disney World, what they love, what they don't love, attractions, resorts, restaurants, comparing to Disneyland, so many more. It's just a fun way to hear from these guys that go to the park so often, get their opinions. A lot I agree with, some not so much, but it's a very fun show. And I can't wait for you to hear it, and it's going to be here next week. Remember, we're doing weekly shows now of the Tomorrow Society podcast. A lot of fun episodes on the way that I think you're going to enjoy. Thank you so much, as always, for listening to the show and for all the support. I really appreciate it, and I will talk to you again next week.